Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. Today, we're talking about the online magazine Slate and how it built a thriving live events business around its incredibly popular podcasts. While it seems like every publisher, from the New York Times to Vox, is making significant investments in podcasting, one could argue that Slate was the earliest to invest in the medium. It launched the Slate Political Gabfest, a panel show with 3 regular hosts, all the way back in 2005. Since then, Slate has debuted dozens of new podcasts, which collectively generate millions of downloads each month. And starting in 2009, shortly after President Barack Obama's inauguration, it started hosting live events centered around these podcasts. Slate has since expanded its live events business, and it now hosts sold-out shows in cities all across the U.S. I recently sat down with Faith Smith, the executive producer for Slate Live. We discussed how her team selects which cities to tour in, how she negotiates with event venues, and what podcast fans are willing to pay in order to watch a live podcast recording. Let's jump right into it. Hey, Faith, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So you're the executive producer for Slate Live. What does that entail?
Yes, I am. That entails the full running of all live programming that we do here at Slate. We are a small team, so I'm really involved in every event that we do from start to finish. We do about 25 live podcast shows a year around the country, sometimes around the world. And then we do probably another 25 Future Tense events, which is part of our technology vertical on Slate. So it's a slightly different type of event. So overall, we run about 50 events around the country every year. These are public events. They are live podcast shows or conferences or occasionally something a little lighter like a happy hour.
And you're kind of in charge of all or at least leading the team that has to come up with basically all the little minutia and logistics that go into putting on a live event, many of the things that I guess the average person wouldn't even think about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a million decisions go into making every event. And we run the minutia, we run the logistics. I'm also over sort of the content of the event where I work with the podcast teams or the hosts or the editorial team to sort of determine what the event is, what's going to happen, if the event should happen, where it should take place. So all of the decisions from big to small are sort of under my purview.
So you're saying 25 events a year, so that's about like one event every 2 weeks. Is it kind of like on a set schedule, or is it more kind of sporadic than that?
Yeah, I wish it was spread out throughout the year, but there are sort of busy times and quieter times. I would say like August and December, we don't tend to do a lot. Just because of vacations and travel and sort of the appetite for attending public events that the audience might have. And then we have really busy times, like here we are in October, and I have 2 to 3 events a week for a couple weeks in a row.
And like for the Slate podcast, do all the podcasts, do they have associated live events, or like what makes you consider a particular Slate podcast a good candidate for a live event?
Yeah, that's a great question. So not everybody who has a podcast has done a live show with me. I'm always looking to get more of our hosts, more of our podcasts out on the road in front of their audiences. There's such a variety of factors that go into deciding. The number one thing is sort of the audience loyalty has to be there, that connection, that sort of desire and drive to see your favorite hosts live and in person. And I do think that all of their podcasts across the network have a really good relationship with their audience. So that's there to some degree for every show we have. Another big factor is sort of hosts, their willingness to do live shows. And I think I've never really met a host that just doesn't want to do live shows. It might come down to scheduling and availability. A lot of our hosts and a lot of our more popular hosts actually have outside jobs. And so this is sort of something they do on the side, like the Political Gabfest, which is our most popular show and our most popular live show. You know, the 3 hosts have really big day jobs. So as much as I'd love to have them on the road every week, we have our limitations. And so it comes down to like availability And also, we don't want to oversaturate the market. We're sort of cognizant of where the Slate audience is and how many shows we think we could do in a given area. But I do think we could be doing more if we. I think the audience would support us doing more. It's often about capacity as well.
And so, like, take Political Gabfest as an example. Like, when they're on the road, who's on the? So it's the three of them, and then who else is also on the road from Slate?
Yeah, their fantastic producer Jocelyn goes with them to all the shows, and I'm usually with them, or my other producer Kirsten Holtz, who's sort of running the live portion and working with the venue and helping to ensure staging is right and all that. So it's sort of a two podcasters tag teaming on the live shows, where we have the podcast producer who's going to record the audio, who's helping to oversee sort of the content as they normally do on a show, and working with the hosts in that way, and then the live producer making sure it's a great experience for the live audience, ironing out wrinkles with the venue, the AV, the staging, all that good stuff.
And what is the strategic value of live events? Like, I've seen some reporting that at least from a ticket sales, it's kind of a break-even thing. I mean, obviously there are sponsorships and stuff like that, but is it a revenue driver? Is it a way to build a stronger connection to the audience? What? How do you guys kind of rank the value that it brings?
Yeah, it's all of the above, and I am very lucky that we don't purely look at. Well, I don't think I'm lucky, because I would say none of my events are break even. We do make money on all of our shows, because we have a great audience that really shows up at the box office. But we don't only look at revenue and the bottom line to determine if an event or an event series is a success. So it's really the best way to get to know our podcast audience. It's a very galvanizing experience if you're a fan, to see your favorite podcasters live and in person, to meet them at a pre-show cocktail hour is like a really fantastic experience. I go to these shows all the time, and I still think they're really fun and engaging, and they really they're the highlight of the week for me. So it's the connection with the audience, which is key. It's about loyalty. It's about sort of building on a relationship that we have with them. It's a very important factor in our Slate Plus membership drive. I mean, it's one of the benefits that you get when you sign up for Slate Plus. You get a 30% discount on all ticket sales. You get early access to tickets. We do occasionally do events or shows or gatherings only for Slate Plus members. So it's sort of all of those factors together that makes us decide how to do events, when to do events, and if they're successful.
So Slate Plus is a product where it's basically like a $5 a month membership program where, if someone signs up for it, they get extra bonus material, like extra podcast material. And then, as you say, they also get perks from a live perspective. Can you talk about like a little bit more about that integration? Like how many Slate Plus members are actually taking advantage of like the early bird tickets or the Slate Plus only cocktail hours and stuff like that? Like how powerful is that in terms of integration with the Slate Live?
Yeah, I don't have those exact figures in front of me. It's something we'd have to sort of look into the data, but it is a little bit. Let's acknowledge this. It is a little bit limiting. We have Slate Plus members all over the world, and we don't do shows in every town all over the world. So not everybody who's a Slate Plus member is going to be able to access this particular perk. We do try to do shows throughout the country, but the bulk of the people who are able to tap into this are going to be on the East Coast, on the West Coast, perhaps Chicago, where we tend to do the bulk of our shows. So I think about 10% of people signing up for Slate Plus say that one of the main reason they're signing up is to get access to the ticket discount. And we're almost at 50,000 Slate Plus members. Some of our bigger shows where we have a lot of listeners, DC, New York, maybe San Francisco, where we have a lot of members, we'll have as up to 40% of the tickets go to Slate Plus members.
Mm-hmm. And what about driving it the other way? Like you said that like live events help increased loyalty, do you see any kind of conversions going the other way where someone comes, like any data showing that people coming to a live show are more likely to sign up for Slate Plus or something like that?
Yeah, I don't have figures on that data.
So you mentioned that you can't go into every city. Like obviously cities like DC, New York, LA, they're good for hosting events. They're big population centers. How do you decide on like
Mhm.
whether a smaller city is worth it?
Yeah, I mean, we use megaphone technology to get a good sense of where our podcast listeners are. We at Slate have a good idea where most of our readers are. So um, that helps. So when we get past like the top 6 cities, for example, we kind of dive into sort of like 5 through 20 on the list, and those tend to be the cities we'll want to target. I mean, we do have a broad sense that we want to be hitting the middle of the country more. We did a great show in St. Louis early in the year. We were just in Austin, where we were in Denver. The year before, we have our eye on, Minneapolis and Phoenix in early 2019. So we kind of know the cities where we have a good pocket of listeners, and they're never going to be as big as they're probably not going to be as big as like a New York show, for example, but I know we're going to get a good turnout. I know we have like a really great base of fans there. And so we do look at the numbers. We also have people emailing and sending requests on Twitter, on Facebook, saying, come to this city, come to this place. And occasionally they're incredibly helpful, and they'll tell me like what venue we should go to, and they'll offer to help run the show or volunteer to be our eyes and ears on the ground. And we love that. And so that's sort of like the anecdotal evidence of where we have a strong fan base as well.
And like, so you mentioned like megaphone. So I'm guessing like you can get some, at least a slightly geotagged look at like where downloads are coming from. Like, have you ever been surprised by a particular podcast? Like let's say it's like, The Gist or something like that, where you're like all of a sudden seeing like tons of downloads in Nashville, and that like kind of affected your strategy?
That's a great question. I Occasionally we do kind of swap an idea based on the numbers. Like, we wanted to go to Seattle. We've been trying to get to Seattle for a while, and then we looked at the numbers. We're like, actually, we have a lot more listeners in Portland, which, I think just based on the population numbers, we were a little surprised by that. So we were like, let's go to Portland instead. So that sort of thing might happen. We chose to go to St. Louis last week because we were looking at like 5 cities, and we didn't expect St. Louis to be the top that have the top number of listeners of the 5 cities we were looking at, but it did, and so that helped guide the decision. I don't think we've had any like massive surprises. Like we don't have like a huge just listenership in Duluth, for example, at least not on the data I've seen. But I suspect if somebody were watching the data more closely week to week for a particular show, I'd see surprises here and there.
Mm-hmm. And
but people listen to podcasts all over, so like it would take a lot to really surprise us.
Yeah. And I guess like you guys don't do like like This American Life has I don't know if they still do it, but they've had in the past where they'll do like a live event, but then they'll scale it to or sorry, stream it to theaters, or like I think like some conferences that you could pay like some smaller amount and have the conference or like the different panels streamed that you can watch live. Have you guys experimented with that or thought about that at all?
So we have done a few live stream events here and there, but we've just offered them for free to people following us on Facebook, or we've put them on slate.com. We haven't, I don't see us going the route of like booking theaters and putting on a show that streams there. I also that's not really Slatey. We're not huge entertainers. We don't put on spectacles. We're really focused on the conversation, journalistic interviews, great experiences. We will have like musical guests from time to time. We'll do something fun. We did a show where we had improv actors, elaborating on what the conversation around politics was, and that was really fun and interesting. But it was just a special thing that we did for our audience. We don't really have the grand ambitions to take over theaters and put on spectacles.
Well, I mean, that kind of like what can you do with a live event that you can't do with a standard podcast recording, and like how much of that is kind of going into like your team, like how much is your team like strategizing around that? Like, what can we do to offer something extra rather than just the standard recording?
Yeah, I mean, it's a question where it's a conversation we're having all the time. I mean, we're just about to embark on our slow burn tour, which is going to hit 5 cities, and a big part of the conversation is like, what can we deliver for this audience that wouldn't necessarily work for the podcast? How can we make it special? And so, there's some visuals and some interesting images that are going to be part of the live show that are just going to be cut out of the podcast because they don't translate. We do, if we have like a musical guest, we're not going to put a whole musical set in the middle of a podcast. It's kind of, it would come across slightly odd. So that tends to be something special for the live audience. We always have a little bit of, like even just for our most basic shows, which are the Gabfest, which is just, which centers around three people talking. We always have like opening and closing banter. We have moments that are just for the live audience that kind of, it's a conversation between the hosts and them, and it's not really for the listening audience at home. Uh, we have, we often will have guests at our live Gabfest shows, which they're not really guest heavy on the podcast. So that just sort of makes for a different experience when you attend live. And also the main thing you get going to the live show, it's you're part of it. You're in the room where it happens. You're not it's like you're having the conversation with your friends rather than listening in on it. So those are all the things that you get at a live show that you won't get in the podcast.
And what kind of like when you're setting ticket prices, what kind of pricing considerations are there? I mean, like, do people like obviously live theater can be really expensive. Like, do people view it as live theater, or is this something that you can't really like touch those kinds of price points? Like most of the things I've been to, it's rare that the pricing is over like $35 or something like that, which is definitely lower than obviously if I want to go see Book of Mormon or something like that. Where do you see it come at, like how much are you guys testing prices, and where do you see kind of the limits of what people are willing to spend?
Yeah, I mean, I think the price you mentioned is about our average ticket price. I think it would be unfair to try to charge somebody to attend a live podcast show what you would charge to attend a theatrical performance where you have, dozens of actors and you have scenery and you have a lot more involved. There's like a much bigger investment. Also, a podcast is something you're used to listening for free. So I think people will pay for the premium experience of attending. They will pay to see their favorite people live and to be part of the energy of it. But to go from paying $0 to paying 85 or 100, I think I think it's a threshold very few people would be willing to cross. We often sell out our shows, which tells me we could probably be charging more. And I am still okay with the ticket prices that we usually charge. If we have one of our very popular shows in a small theater that we know is going to go fast, we might charge a little bit more to sort of tap into that demand. But we want our shows to be open and accessible. We want people who read Slate and listen to our Slate podcast to be able to come. So we don't want to make them so expensive that they'd be out of reach for a lot of people. I mean, we do offer sort of the premium option of like a pre-show or a post-show cocktail hour where you can come. It's not a meet and greet where you stand in line and shake hands with your favorite podcaster. You're at a cocktail party with them. You're mingling with other super fans. You're sharing cocktail chatter with David Plotz and Emily Bazelon. And those experiences people are willing to pay a lot more for, but it's a really special experience. So there's...
How intimate is that? Like how many people are able to get into the cocktail hour?
Usually around 60. Yeah, we want the hosts like to be able to talk to everybody, or at least have a little bit of interaction with everyone. And when we get much bigger than 60, it's harder to do that.
How do sponsorships differ for live events? Like, is there like a separate, is that like a separate thing that you're selling, or is it basically just whatever the sponsor for the podcast is, they're just doing a live host read, or do you charge differently for if you're doing it at a live event? Like, how do you guys approach that?
Yeah, if you hear a sponsor at a live show, they have purposely uh, come on board to be a partner with the live show. It's not just like a carryover from the podcast. In fact, if you go to a Slate podcast live show, you will very likely not hear host reads of you won't hear ads read at the show unless we have a sponsor specifically for the live show. We try to take the normal ad listening experience out of the live show unless somebody has come on board as a special partner, and then it's going to be a slightly different experience than just your typical ad read. It'll be a little bit more integrated. We'll do something more fun and creative with them, and just sort of pull the brand into the live experience.
And do like brands value that? Like, is that like a strong value proposition that they get more out of it from the live show than they would from the just standard podcast?
Yeah, I think those who have made that investment and been sponsors of our live shows, they definitely have seen it. It's much more integrated. It's much more energetic. It's much more fun than an in studio ad read, and so I think they do see the value of that investment.
Can you talk a little bit about your relationship with the venues, like what your process is for selecting venues, like how do you like what are the, like some of the things that you have to take into consideration in terms of, I guess, what their cut is, how many seats they have, what kind of I used to go to Pop-Up Magazine religiously, and then they switched to a new venue that uses like Ticketmaster, or those ones that
Yeah.
have that have terrible service fees and stuff. And I finally just stopped going because it was adding like an extra $20 onto the price. Like, what are all these things that you have to consider when you're like looking for a venue?
Yeah, those are really good points. And, I like the experience. I try to think about the experience from the view of the ticket purchaser and like the value that they want to get and the experience they want to have. We do, like I said, we do shows of all different sizes all over the country. So we have to work with a very wide variety of venues. And I will say, I don't use an external booker. We do all our show booking in house. And because we're kind of eliminating that middleman and third party, we have a little bit more control over uh, who we work with and what it is we're looking for. And it also doesn't inflate our ticket prices because we're trying to like give someone else a cut. And I have I have an aversion to working with Ticketmaster for the same reason. I try very hard to avoid working at a venue that exclusively uses Ticketmaster because it adds like 25-30% on top of the ticket, which is really crazy. So you either have to significantly lower your ticket to make it more reasonable for the people buying, or you just know that you're going to annoy your fans, and we try to avoid annoying our fans. So that is something to look at. I mean, we look at, the number one thing we need is AV capability. When I'm reaching out to anybody or any venues reaching out to me, I have my, you would call it a tech writer or AV requirements that we send them. And the bulk of what we need when we leave a live show is we need to be able to leave with great audio that we can share with our, tens of thousands of listeners at home. So that's like a huge thing on the checklist to make sure they have the AV capability that we need. We look at the number of seats. We want to make sure we can accommodate the right number. We don't want like to be in a large cavernous theater with just a few hundred people because that's not a fun experience for anybody. We want to sort of find the sweet spot that we can fill it and not so small that we fill it in a week and then we know we could have gone much bigger. So that really depends on the podcast that we're booking or the show that we're doing. So I sort of analyze like their listenership and their numbers and past shows they've done, and when making decisions about size, we look at their fees. We sort of do the calculation of if we charge this for ticket and they have this many seats, and then what we need to pay to rent the space, or if they take a cut, what that is. So it's a pretty elaborate vetting process, and there's like a lot of emails and phone calls back and forth to make sure a venue works for us, and then we have to do it, dozens of times throughout the year as we travel to new cities, especially we're like starting from scratch every time. In the cities we work in most often, I sort of have some go-to venues that we know work really well. We have a good relationship with them. And so that makes it easy when I know I can go back to, a place that we like in Brooklyn and DC or in San Francisco.
And is it like a very competitive market in the sense of like you have lots of choices so you can like use that from a negotiating standpoint? Like, I don't know how many, like if you guys need like a venue with a minimum of 500 seats, there might be only a very small number. Like what are your options in terms of like having at least a little bit of leverage?
It really depends on the city. Some cities we have a lot of options and they're very reasonable, and it's pretty easy to book. And some cities are really impossible. And a lot of our shows, like our biggest shows are around 1,500 people, but a lot of our shows are sort of 500 to 700 people, and it's really hard to find a venue that size. If you go to a small theater, it's usually 200 or less, and then most big theaters are 1,000, 3,000 people. So the middle range size theater is sort of the hardest one to find. So that's sort of a layer of complexity. And some cities just have everything we need, and there's a lot of options. And some cities that I'm often surprised by have very few options in that range. And then, they might be booked up 6 months in advance.
Do you guys do any like live speaking? Like obviously there's speaker bureaus and stuff like that. Obviously these podcast hosts are kind of becoming their own kinds of celebrities. Like do you guys currently, or are there any discussions of like almost having like a speakers bureau arm of like Slate Live where if someone wants to hire Dave Plotz to come speak at a university or something, that you guys are managing that? Or is there, I don't know if there's like any opportunities on that front.
That's a really good idea, Simon. I'm gonna capitalize on this idea. So I don't do that, and in fact, a lot of our more famous hosts have their own speaking agents and their own networks that they work with to do that. It's not something we've done. I will occasionally work with an editor or a writer who has an invitation and talk to them about the gig or about what they want to do, but just to sort of give some professional advice. But it's not something we actively do. But now that you mention it, I'm gonna do it. That's a good idea.
Yeah. I had another question. So do you guys like do any other collaborations with like non-Slate podcasts or podcast festivals or anything like that? In the same way that obviously there are like film festivals and stuff. Mm-hmm. I know there are more live events that are coming around podcast. Do you guys do anything with that?
Occasionally. There's so many podcast festivals, and every year I'm like deflecting a lot of invitations for our shows. We don't tend to, I do not tend to love sending my shows to the podcast festivals. I don't think it's the most amazing way to showcase Slate shows and Slate talent. It's often a crowded space. People are sort of running from one thing to the next, and that's not really the experience we want the Slate Live experience to be. So I don't do a ton of festivals. We have in the past done several, and they've been fine. We just did a big partnership with the Texas Tribune Festival. This is why we were in Austin. We did like a whole day of podcasting in our own space that was sort of connected to the big Texas Tribune Festival they do every year. And that was a really fantastic partnership, but we were sort of, in our own area, standing on our own, and we were able to attract the Slate audience as well as sort of work with them to overlap with the Texas Tribune audience. So that was an example of I think a good, unique partnership that worked well for us, but just going to a lot of festivals, it doesn't really appeal to how we want to present our live shows.
And how does your non-podcast content differ? Like you mentioned future tense, like mm-hmm. How does your job differ when setting up that or working on those kinds of projects?
Yeah, those are very different type of events. So Future Tense is a partnership between Slate New America Foundation, a think tank here in DC, and Arizona State University. And all of our events are free because of our partnership. It's part academic, part think tanky. The goal of these events is to sort of educate the public and get people involved in conversations around emerging technology and how they'll affect uh, public policy and society. So the approach is very different. We're not trying to sell tickets. We're not looking at revenue. We're really focused on a great conversation, which is really at the core of every event we do. There's also the partners are involved, so it's it's a more involved process, and we tend to think more of the whole year of programming and sort of what are the big technologies, what are the topics and conversations we want to touch on when planning Future Tense. Whereas with like a live podcast show, we do look at the year ahead and we do have like some bigger strategy, but it's not sort of like one big series that we're planning. So,
And have you, in terms of like how quickly you sign up, you sell out tickets versus how many tickets you're able to sell in larger and larger venues? Like, do you see that it's tracking relatively with the growth of podcasting in general?
That's a great question. I don't, I think a little bit, yes. So as one of, like, just speaking about Slate Podcast, as a podcast is becoming more popular and getting more ears, that show is going to be more popular and probably sell out more quickly or sell out a bigger venue. So that is true. But as the podcast platform, like as podcasting grows as a form of media and more people are listening to it and more people are producing podcasts, you also have more people producing live podcast shows. And, Slate did its first live podcast show in January 2009. So we're really not following the crowd here, but the space is becoming more crowded. So if you're in Chicago or New York or even DC, the novelty of a live podcast show is not what it used to be a couple years ago. So our numbers are growing year after year. That is true. I think we're constantly trying to deliver new, more interesting live shows that connect with our audience, but the space is also getting more crowded. So I don't know that live show ticket sales are growing as fast as podcasting is.
Okay. Well, Faith, those were all the questions I had. Thanks so much for joining me. Where can people find you online?
They could find out about Slate Live at slate.com/live. That's where I want everybody to look. You can find out about our shows, and that's the most important thing to plug.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. This was a lot of fun.
All right. This is great. Thank you, Simon.
Okay, that's all we have for you today. Be sure to subscribe to the Business of Content on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. See you next week.